desert did not kill him, it simply waited. Sand howled across the Libyan plateau like a living thing, erasing tracks, swallowing time, and burying secrets so completely that even history itself forgot where they lay. When the storm finally settled, nothing moved except heat and memory. And somewhere beneath 70 years of silence, a fighter plane rested exactly where it had fallen, its pilot's final moments still trapped inside the metal skin of a forgotten war. In June 1942, Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping of the Royal Air Force climbed into the cockpit of a Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawk with orders so routine they barely registered as danger. A ferry flight. No guns loaded, no escort. Just a single aircraft moving between distant desert airfields as the North African campaign burned itself into legend. The Kittyhawk's engine roared alive, coughing dust into the sky as it lifted from Gambut airstrip. Copping adjusted his goggles, squinting into the blinding sun. The horizon dissolved almost instantly into a pale shimmer. In the Sahara there were no landmarks, only distance and faith. He was 24 years old. Below him stretched a battlefield without trenches or front lines. Rommel's Afrika Korps surged east and west like a tide, while RAF squadrons bled aircraft daily trying to slow them. Planes vanished here all the time. Some burned, some exploded, others simply never returned. Dennis checked his compass. It trembled. At first he ignored it. The flight into nothing, the P-40 was a rugged machine, thick-skinned, reliable, built for punishment. But even it had limits. The desert heat clawed at the engine, thinning the air, robbing lift inch by inch. Radio reception faded into static within minutes. Then the compass spun. Copping frowned, tapping the glass with a gloved finger. No response. He banked slightly, searching for a reference point. There was none. The desert below was an endless parchment of sand and stone, wind-carved and mercilessly identical in every direction. Fuel ticked down. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere behind him, the war raged on without noticing his absence. He altered course, trusting instinct more than instruments now. Every pilot feared this moment, not combat, not flak, but being alone in the Sahara, where even a perfect landing could be a death sentence. Minutes passed. Then more. The engine sputtered. Dennis didn't panic. Panic was loud. Panic was wasteful. He scanned for flat ground and found it everywhere and nowhere. The Kittyhawk descended in a long, controlled glide, wheels barely skimming the surface before touching down with a jolt that rattled his bones. Sand exploded around the aircraft. The engine coughed once, then stopped. Silence swallowed everything. Alone, Dennis sat motionless for several seconds, hands still gripping the controls. The ticking of cooling metal echoed unnaturally loud in the cockpit. He pulled off his goggles, sweat stinging his eyes. No smoke, no fire. A miracle. He climbed down onto the sand, boots sinking slightly. The heat struck him instantly, an invisible hammer. The aircraft stood intact, paint faded but proud, RAF roundels glaring against the desert like eyes that refused to close. He checked the fuel tanks. Empty. Dennis shaded his eyes and turned slowly in a full circle. Nothing. No dust trails, no aircraft, no structures. Just the desert, stretching endlessly in every direction, indifferent and absolute. He understood then. No one was coming. The first day standard procedure. He did everything by the book. Dennis retrieved his survival kit, water rations, a pistol, a signaling mirror, flares. He took shelter in the shade of the Kittyhawk's wing, conserving energy, writing notes in his logbook. The RAF drilled this into every pilot. If you go down, leave a record. He marked the date. He described the landing. He noted the compass failure. His handwriting was neat, controlled, calm. As the sun dipped lower, the desert cooled rapidly. Stars erupted across the sky with terrifying clarity. Dennis lay back against the fuselage, staring upward, thinking of England, of green fields, of rain, of things that grew. Sleep came in fragments, so did hope. The days that followed day two stripped illusions away. Water ration, movements minimal. Dennis climbed the wing each morning, scanning the horizon with binoculars until his eyes burned. No aircraft, no smoke, no sign of life. The desert was not empty, it was hostile by omission. By day 4, he stopped scanning as much. By day 6, he stopped writing full sentences. The notes became shorter. Still nothing, compass useless, aircraft intact. His pistol remained untouched. The final entry, no one knows exactly which day he stopped writing. The logbook ends abruptly mid-thought. The last entry trails off as if interrupted not by danger but by exhaustion. The desert didn't rush him, it simply outlasted him. Wind began its work. Sand crept into the cockpit, over the wings, around the tires. Years passed, then decades. Wars ended. Empires collapsed. Satellites traced lines across the sky where he once flew blind, and the Kittyhawk remained, waiting. 70 years later, in 2012, a modern survey aircraft spotted something impossible. A shape, perfectly preserved. A World War II fighter plane sat in the Sahara as if it had landed yesterday, paint intact, cockpit closed, serial numbers legible. When images reached historians, disbelief turned to awe. This wasn't a wreck, it was a time capsule. Inside, they found his logbook, and with it, a voice that had been silent for 70 years finally spoke again. But the desert still had more to reveal, and not all of it was peaceful. The first man to see it thought he was hallucinating. From several thousand feet above the Libyan desert, the shape looked too clean, too precise. Wrecks didn't survive the Sahara like this. They shattered, scattered, disappeared. But this was an aircraft sitting upright, wings level, casting a sharp shadow like a sundial frozen in time. When the coordinates were confirmed, disbelief spread through aviation circles like wildfire. Satellite imagery followed, then high-resolution passes. A Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawk, intact, not buried, not broken, not scavenged. It sat alone, 70 years late to the war. The Discovery, the first ground team, arrived days later, their vehicles kicking up dust that hadn't been disturbed since the 1940s. They stopped several hundred meters away and cut their engines, stepping out in silence as if approaching a grave. The aircraft loomed larger with every step. RAF roundels were still visible. The desert sun had bleached the paint but not erased it. The serial number ET-574 was unmistakable. Even the canopy glass, clouded but unbroken, reflected the sky. One of the archaeologists whispered, "It looks like the pilot just stepped away." No impact scars, no fire damage. The landing gear was down, aligned perfectly. This was not a crash. This was a landing. They circled the Kittyhawk slowly, afraid almost to touch it. Sand had piled gently around the wheels and lower fuselage, but the desert had preserved rather than consumed. When they opened the cockpit, hot air rushed out, carrying a smell that was part metal, part dust, part history. Inside lay the pilot's world. Maps folded with care, emergency rations unopened, flares untouched, and on the seat, partially covered in sand, a logbook. Dennis Copping speaks. The book was fragile, its pages stiff with age, but the ink had survived. Each line was a voice reaching forward through 7 decades. June 28, 1942. Engine failure. Forced landing. Aircraft intact. The entries were methodical at first, written by a trained RAF pilot doing exactly what he had been taught. But as the pages progressed, something changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but subtly. The handwriting grew tighter. The margins shrank. The desert was closing in. There were no goodbye notes, no final confessions, just quiet endurance, written by a man who believed until the end that rescue was possible. For the team holding that logbook, the realization was crushing. Dennis Copping hadn't vanished. He had waited. The war he never left in 1942, the North African campaign, was chaos made tangible. Airfields were abandoned overnight. Squadrons relocated constantly. Records were lost, misfiled, destroyed. Dennis's aircraft was listed as missing, presumed lost. The war did not pause long enough to notice one young pilot swallowed by the desert, and so his Kittyhawk became a ghost, frozen between moments while the world moved on without it. Back in Britain, families grieved without bodies. Names were etched into memorials. Dennis's name joined them, just another casualty of a vast and merciless conflict. Until now. Forensic silence. The investigation team searched the area thoroughly. They did not find remains, no bones, no uniform fragments, no grave. Only footprints, faint impressions hardened in ancient sand leading away from the aircraft before vanishing entirely. Dennis had walked. The direction suggested he believed help lay somewhere ahead, perhaps a supply route, perhaps an airfield that no longer existed. The Sahara had offered him no correction. Historians debated his fate. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, disorientation. The desert was a patient killer. But what mattered more was what the aircraft told them. The engine failure was real. The landing was skilled. Dennis had survived the moment that killed so many others. His story was not one of defeat. It was one of endurance. The decision what to do with the Kittyhawk became an immediate and heated debate. Some argued it should remain untouched, a perfect, accidental memorial. Others insisted it belonged in a museum where Dennis's story could finally be told. Before consensus could form, disaster struck. Local scavengers arrived. The desert that had protected the aircraft for 70 years could not protect it from modern hands. Parts were removed, instruments vanished, the radio was stripped. The Kittyhawk, once a complete time capsule, began to bleed history piece by piece. By the time authorities intervened, the aircraft was damaged beyond pristine preservation, and something irreplaceable had been lost. The weight of time as word spread. The story captured global attention. Aviation historians, veterans, families of RAF pilots all felt the pull of this machine that refused to fade. Dennis Copping was no longer a name on a stone. He was a man again. A pilot who made a perfect landing in an impossible place. A survivor who did everything right and still disappeared. But the story wasn't finished yet, because the desert had one more revelation to offer. And it would not be found in metal. It would be found in memory. Long before the desert claimed him, Dennis Copping was simply a boy who loved machines. He grew up in England between wars, in a country still haunted by the memory of trenches and telegrams delivered at dawn. Aircraft fascinated him not as weapons, but as defiance. They were proof that gravity could be argued with. When war came again, Dennis didn't hesitate. He joined the Royal Air Force, not chasing glory but purpose. Becoming a pilot training was brutal. The RAF needed pilots faster than it could polish them. Mistakes killed. Arrogance killed faster. Dennis learned discipline, precision, restraint. Instructors noted his calm. Reliable, one wrote. Not flashy, trustworthy. Those traits saved his life in the Sahara, at least at first. By 1942, he was assigned to North Africa, ferrying aircraft between scattered airfields carved out of sand and desperation. The work was dangerous in ways no medal could honor. No dogfights, no victories, just long flights alone over featureless terrain. And on one of those flights, the desert closed its hand. The psychology of isolation. Modern survival experts studied Dennis's actions through the logbook. He did almost everything correctly. Shelter, rationing, minimal movement. But the Sahara plays tricks no training can fully counter. The horizon bends. Distances lie. Hope becomes an enemy when it sends you walking toward mirages. Dennis likely believed rescue was imminent. Aircraft passed overhead constantly during the campaign. He may have seen contrails, heard engines. Each sound would have reignited belief. Each silence afterward would have deepened the cruelty. What he never knew, incredibly, Dennis had landed not far from Allied activity, but at the wrong time. Units moved. Airfields relocated. Routes changed. By the time search operations could have passed near him, the war had already shifted elsewhere. He was stranded not by distance, but by timing. History missed him by days, perhaps hours. The legacy forgotten when the Kittyhawk was finally transported damaged, incomplete to a museum facility. The reaction was mixed. Some mourned what had been lost to looting, others focused on what remained. But for many, the aircraft had already served its greatest purpose. It had reminded the world that war is not only fought in battles. Sometimes it is fought alone. Dennis Copping did not die in combat, he died waiting. The desert's memory today, the Sahara, still holds secrets. Aircraft, tanks, footprints erased and rewritten endlessly by wind. But the Kittyhawk changed something. It forced historians to confront the quiet stories, the ones without explosions or victory parades. The stories of men who followed orders, trusted their training, and vanished anyway. Dennis Copping's aircraft should not have survived, but it did, and because of that, neither did his silence. The story should have ended with the aircraft. That was the assumption, a rediscovered relic, a tragic pilot, a desert that preserved what the war forgot. But history is rarely content with a single conclusion. Once the photographs circulated globally, something unexpected happened. Veterans began writing letters. Families searched old boxes. Archivists reopened files that had not been touched in decades. The Kittyhawk did not merely resurface, it reactivated memory. Dennis Copping's name began appearing in places it never had before. The family that never knew in Britain, surviving relatives were contacted carefully, respectfully. Most had grown up with only fragments. He went missing in North Africa. His aircraft was lost. There was never a grave. Now there was an aircraft. There was handwriting. There was proof that Dennis had lived beyond the moment history had recorded. For some, the relief was painful. For others, unbearable. One relative said quietly, "We always imagined it was quick." Now they knew it wasn't. A modern moral dilemma, the question returned heavier than before. What is owed to the dead? Some argued the Kittyhawk should be fully restored, rebuilt, repainted, made airworthy, celebrated as a triumph of aviation archaeology. Others recoiled at the idea. This was his last shelter, one historian said. Restoring it erases the truth of what happened here. Museums debated fiercely. Governments hesitated. Every decision felt like trespass, and hovering over it all was the unanswered question that no one could ignore. Where did Dennis go? Following the footsteps using satellite mapping and ground analysis, researchers traced the faint footprint trail recorded at the site. Environmental modeling suggested Dennis walked during early morning or late evening when heat was survivable. He had chosen direction deliberately. Not random wandering. Hope guided him. Experts believe he may have followed what he thought was a supply route, one that had shifted months earlier. The desert had changed faster than his information. He walked into absence, and the Sahara closed behind him. The silence between moments, the most haunting realization, was not how Dennis died, but how long he may have lived. Days, possibly longer. Time stretches cruelly in isolation. Each sunrise would have felt like permission to believe. Each sunset, a negotiation with despair. No enemy fired a shot, no explosion marked the end. Just silence, and thirst, and waiting. By the way, if you're still walking this desert with me, still tracing these footsteps through time, make sure to hit subscribe. There's more ahead, and it matters. The story does not stop here. The aircraft as witnessed, the Kittyhawk itself became evidence not of failure but of competence. Dennis landed flawlessly. He conserved resources. He followed procedure. Nothing in the aircraft suggested panic, which made the ending harder to accept. Because it meant this wasn't a story of error, it was a story of circumstance. And circumstance does not apologize. Time does not judge. People do. As the Kittyhawk story entered documentaries, museums, and academic journals, a darker question surfaced, one rarely spoken aloud. Could Dennis have been saved? The answer, maddeningly, was yes and no. The search that never happened during the North African campaign, missing aircraft were often logged without follow-up. Fuel shortages, constant movement, enemy pressure, there was simply no capacity to search endlessly. Dennis's flight was routine. When he didn't arrive, it blended into noise. No deliberate neglect. Just wartime triage. And yet, knowing how close Allied units had passed weeks later changed everything. History had missed him by a margin too small to forgive. Looting and loss. The looting of the Kittyhawk cast a shadow over its rediscovery. Radios, instruments, even cockpit panels vanished into private hands. The outrage was global, not because of monetary value, but because those objects were the last physical echoes of a man's final stand against isolation. What survived became sacred. What was lost could never be replaced. Restoration or reverence. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The aircraft would not fly again. It would not be cosmetically perfected. Instead, it would be preserved in a state that told the truth. Faded paint. Scars. A cockpit that still felt occupied, because this was not a machine to be admired. It was a story to be listened to. Dennis Copping reclaimed at last. His name was spoken aloud in ceremonies. Articles replaced footnotes. His story entered RAF history not as a missing file, but as a lesson. He represented thousands like him, men whose wars ended without witnesses, men who obeyed, endured, and vanished. Dennis Copping was no longer forgotten. But the desert still had the final word. The Sahara has no monuments, no plaques. No names carved in stone. It remembers differently. It remembers by refusing to erase. 70 years after Dennis Copping climbed out of his Kittyhawk, the desert still held his aircraft exactly where he left it, like a paused breath waiting to be released. The war ended. The world rebuilt. Generations passed. And still the Kittyhawk waited. What survived? Paint, paper, metal. But more than that, intent. Dennis's intent to live. To be found, to matter. The desert allowed that intent to endure long enough for us to hear it. The final irony: Dennis did not die in battle. He died believing rescue was coming. And in the end it did. Just too late for him, but not too late for history. A time capsule, not a tomb. The Kittyhawk is no longer just an aircraft. It is a message from a man to a future he never saw, from a war to a world that still struggles to understand its cost. Every visitor who stands before it stands closer to Dennis Copping than any historian ever did, because now we know where he landed, we know how he waited, and we know that the desert, for once, chose not to forget. The last image: picture the Sahara at dusk. The wind softens, shadows stretch, and somewhere beneath the sand history breathes, waiting.